Welcome back to the build of the gigantic Triton lava table. In this episode, we're going to slab flatten the two halves of the table, we'll get a really good look at the character of the walnut, and after we've built a box mold, we're going to start pouring 70 litres of epoxy. You won't want to miss it. Day 2, and it's time to slab flatten 200 kilos of European walnut. Slabbing is when you repeatedly pass a router over a piece of wood at a set height. You need a special slabbing router bit, and you typically cut back and forth across the entire piece of wood until it has one very flat side. You can buy slab flattening setups, but rarely this big. Sometimes it's easier to fashion your own tools, so that's what we did. Building a slabbing setup is simple, and once you have one, you'll probably use it a lot. Thick sheet material forms the base and raised runners span either side. A bridge or sled sits on these runners over the slab, and the router's in the middle. The router cutter plunges through the sled to cut away at the wood underneath, while remaining at a fixed height. As we set up, you can see that there were some pretty gnarly cracks in the wood. These won't be an issue once strengthened with resin, but they did force us to get pretty creative with chocks for this initial flattening session. Bench dog spacers proved really useful, and we spent a good deal of time adding and removing shims until we were confident that A, the wood wasn't going to move, and B, that it was as close to level as we could make it. Some parts we couldn't fix with shims, so we attacked those with the mini planer. I highly recommend having one. It's very good at removing excess material quickly. We're using the TRA-1, a 3¼ horsepower router. It's built with enough grunt to comfortably tackle big projects with ease. Once happy with our setup, we started slabbing. In hindsight, we should have built this jig off the floor. It was back-breaking work, and we each took it in turns, working our way down the walnut. Looking at this end, you get a better idea of what slabbing does. Doing this on each side of each slab took the rest of the day. With 2 Triton workhorses set up, we had a perfect platform to tackle the next task, sanding. Coming back into this project every day was really rewarding, especially today, where we got to appreciate the result of yesterday's sawbacks with our first proper look at the walnut. Until now, we only had an idea of what it might look like, but every step completed meant we could see more and more what the end result might be, and seeing the table come to life was really exciting.
So along the edge, we've sort of been cleaning it up, but we don't want to get rid of everything. It's possible to get rid of it so that it's nice and clean, but then it's not very natural. So where there are interesting inclusions, we've sort of retained those. Whereas certain other parts are a manufactured live edge, such as this here, where we've just matched the angle of the actual live edge, which is this section here, and just shape this down so that you've got that nice angle all the way down the table. This is going to be so good. Hello, George.
There's still a lot of work ahead, so 2 of us got back to work sanding at the same time to cover as much ground as possible with 80 to 120 grit sandpaper. We need to remove all the small lines created by the slabbing process. When you're sanding, it's really important to work your way up through the different grits. You might be tempted to go from, say, 80 grit to 180 grit, but don't. You won't save yourself any time. If the difference in grit is too large, the higher grit paper won't have the purchase to remove the score lines of the previous paper. A good standard grit progression is 80, 120, 180, 240, 320. You may not need to start as rough as 80 or end as fine as 320. 240 is usually sufficient for most wood types. I personally really love using the 3rd sheet sander. The large surface area means you get a lot done quickly, and the handle set away from the body and motor means it's really comfortable to use. So it's looking good already, but once the resin goes on, the whole thing will transform again. You'll see in a moment that we'd regularly change the type and model of sander we were using depending on what we were trying to achieve, and you should do the same. Orbital sanders, that oscillate in place like the 3rd sheet sander, are great for uniform finishing work. Random orbit sanders, whose sanding pad both oscillates and rotates, are a bit more versatile. The Triton GEOS has a really aggressive fixed-geared orbital mode in addition to a gentle one. In this mode, it behaves a bit more like an angle grinder, and it was perfect for tackling the roughest parts of the wood, where the router hadn't reached. We had a few low areas that we hadn't slabbed with the router, because we wanted to keep the table as thick as possible. Random orbit sanders are also really good for finish sanding. The random orbit, in addition to the oscillation, makes it nearly impossible for the sandpaper to work the same part twice, meaning you're far less likely to get swirl marks. In the last episode, I mentioned that one end of the wood had a really interesting feature that we wanted to keep. Well, here it is. Under where the bark used to be was a really awesome live edge, separate from the rest. Sanding it wasn't an option, so we got out the wire brush to clean it up as best we could. The result was pretty good. Here's your best chance yet to see what we're working with. Look at all the figuring and flaming and grain patterns. All the large cracks, which would normally doom a project, will be comfortably set in resin soon. The plan's to use dark epoxy in the knots, and we had to get really aggressive with the wire brush to get rid of anything loose or punky. If something is loose and it goes walking when you pour your resin, once it sets, it's there forever. Confident that we'd tackled most parts that needed individual work, we got out the big 4-inch belt sanders. If you're a regular woodworker and you don't have a big sander, get one. Trust me. You'll save yourself so much time sanding. Belt sanders can be really aggressive, so it's essential to keep the sander moving and flat against the work surface. You'll notice here that we're keeping the sander in one direction, and there's a good reason for that. When sanding, you can influence how much wood you're removing by either sanding with or across the grain of the wood. If you sand across grain, the sandpaper will rip wood fibres out more easily than if you sand with them. Because you're ripping wood fibres out rather than sanding them down, going across the grain will always leave a rougher finish. It's a really useful thing to remember. If you're looking to sand quickly, sand across the grain. If you want a fine finish, sand with the grain. One slab down. On the second piece, we began straight away with the belt sanders. You can probably tell by looking at them that this piece was naturally much flatter. With 2 4-inch belt sanders on the go, sanding this compared to the first was a walk in the park. Sanding complete, we now need a box mould for the wood to sit in when we pour the epoxy. It's essentially a box without a lid, but you'll need to remember 3 things. Make sure you build the sides high enough that the resin won't overflow. Make it out of a material epoxy doesn't stick to, like melamine, or cover the material in tuck tape, like we did. Use silicone in all the joints and corners to form a perfect seal. Leaking epoxy is not fun to clean up. Box made, and up in Ben's old workshop, we poured and swirled a very thin layer of resin in Triton orange with some metallic pigment. It turned out really well. We were aiming at a 2-tone rivet table, where an orange base layer sits under a clear top layer, so that you get colour, but you still see all the live edge of the wood in the middle. You'll notice we also pre-painted the live edge sides of the river with clear resin. This is essential if you're doing multiple pours. Wood is porous, and the resin curing is an exothermic reaction. If you don't pre-paint the wood, you risk lots of bubbles releasing during the reaction and getting stuck in your table. Resin also sticks to itself really well, so pre-painting the wood gives it a guaranteed solid surface for the next pour to adhere to. With all the orange set, it was showtime for the main pour. A huge shout out to House of Resin here, who hooked us up with over 70 litres of the product amazing deep pour epoxy. When preparing the mixture, it's a good idea to pour as gently as you can. The fewer bubbles you can introduce at every step, the fewer you'll have to worry about fixing later on. Mixing time. Low and slow is the way. Drill set to slow, and the paint paddle completely submerged. You want to spend a good 5 minutes at least in a bucket this size. All the viscous swirls need to disappear, and then you need to mix for a few minutes more, per bucket. It was finally time to pour. We were so excited for this moment. We had cameras set up to capture a tsunami of epoxy. but the sheer size of the space we had to fill meant that a single bucket barely made a dent. 4 or 5 buckets in, we were nearing the top of the river and decided to pour over the edges onto the wood to ensure a full seal. We had the epoxy for it, so why not? And I'm so glad we did. This was our first true indication of what the finished piece was going to look like, and it was incredible. After every pour, you'll want to flash the resin with direct heat to remove bubbles that form during the reaction. Keep an eye on this as you go. Now before we show you properly what it looked like, we'd like to say a huge thank you to Crimson Guitars. We've worked with them for years, and this project wouldn't have been possible without their help and expertise. If you haven't heard of them, check them out on YouTube. The link is in the description. Here it is. We spent ages just staring at it. Ben came to have a look and get in on the action too. Join us in the next episode where the table is now one piece. We'll cut it to size, add metal brackets to the reverse, and start work removing the excess epoxy. Thanks for watching. Let us know what you thought in the comments.